2,000 meters beneath the Bismarck Sea, the seafloor is doing something it has never done before. Not in this place, not at this depth, not at this speed. It is moving, slowly and relentlessly, in a way that deep ocean instruments have tracked since 2019. And here is what unsettles the scientists watching it. This does not look like tectonic drift. The signatures are wrong. The shape of the movement is wrong. And the activity is not steady. It is accelerating, inching faster with every passing season. Something down there is pressing upward against 4 kilometers of water, and whatever it is connects to a story far older and stranger than any modern geological event we have on record. By the time you finish this film, you will understand what it is. For now, sit with the quiet fact that it is happening. To understand what's happening now, we have to go back to when the seafloor first began to speak. The first signals, mid-2019, a line of autonomous hydrophones bobs in deep water off the coast of Papua New Guinea, deployed by the University of Tasmania to listen to the ocean floor. For weeks, the instruments record nothing unusual, just the slow murmur of currents and the distant groan of whale song. Then, one night, a new sound arrives. Low-frequency pulses, regular as a heartbeat, mechanical in their precision. Every few seconds, the same thump, arriving out of the dark water with no discernible source. The team reviews the data, marks the pulses as instrument error, and moves on. A loose cable, a faulty transducer, some electronic ghost. But the pulses keep coming, and when a second array picks up the same signal, then a third, the explanation starts to fall apart. 3 independent systems, hundreds of kilometers apart, recording the identical pattern in lockstep. What they heard next made them stop calling it a malfunction. The pattern emerges. Over the following 6 months, the pulses begin to organize. Scientists chart them day after day, and a rhythm emerges from the noise, a cycle that repeats with startling regularity every 41 hours. They work through the usual suspects one by one. Volcanic tremor, ruled out. The frequency signature is wrong. Whale calls, ruled out. Nothing biological is this mechanical. Human activity, ruled out. There is no shipping lane within 1,000 kilometers of the source. So they triangulate the signal, and the result is strange in its own right. The source is a single point, 4,200 meters down, and it is not drifting with the currents or wandering with the seafloor. It stays fixed, patient, precise, as if it were holding its position on purpose. Then the rhythm changed, and so did the depth readings. Vertical movement. By January of 2020, seismic tomography had done something no one expected. It had given the source a direction. The point at 4,200 meters was rising, not quickly, but measurably, like a slow breath drawn from below. Over 3 months, it climbed 140 meters through the mantle layer. That is not drift, and it is not settling. It is movement with intent, the kind of movement geology does not have a name for. Every known process in the deep earth moves sideways under pressure, or sinks, or fractures. Nothing rises like this, alone, in place, on schedule. The instruments kept the same quiet answer through every recalibration. Up. Steadily, deliberately, up. 140 meters is a tiny thing in the scale of a planet. But it was measured, and it was consistent, and it brought a question the models refused to touch. But that was only the beginning of what the mantle was doing. The deformation zone. While the source climbed, something else was happening directly above it, at the surface of the seafloor. The first hint came not from seismometers, but from satellites, watching the shape of the ocean from orbit. Altimetry data began to show a circular depression forming on the seabed, centered on the point where the source had been, 800 meters across and deepening by centimeters every week. The sediment was being pulled downward and inward into the shape of a bowl. Centimeters a week sounds small until you watch it accumulate. Month after month, the basin widened and sank, and the pull was level, even, all the way around. Not a collapse, not a slide, a draw. Something below was removing material or making room, and the seafloor above was following it down, 1 centimeter at a time. Something down there was creating space for itself. The Bismarck Plate. To understand what that meant, we have to understand where this is happening. The Bismarck Sea does not sit on open, stable crust. It rests on a microplate, a fragment caught in a squeeze between the Pacific Plate and the Australian Plate. These are the slow collisions that build mountains and swallow oceans, and here, where they meet, the crust has cracked into a mosaic. Subduction zones pull, volcanic arcs rise against them, and the whole region shifts and grinds on a scale that keeps no single rhythm. Geologists call this kind of ground a place where the planet's interior is close to the surface. The boundaries run shallow, the heat rises near, and the transfer between what is above and what is below is thin. In most of the world, the deep earth is sealed behind miles of unbroken rock. Here, the seals are weak, the joins are many, and the way down has always been open. And in that chaos, something had found a way through. The expedition. In August of 2020, an international team lowered a deep-sea ROV toward the deformation zone. They'd packed sonar, cameras, and magnetometers, and they expected to find a volcanic vent or a slow dome of mud pushing up through the seabed. Geology has rules for what you find on the ocean floor, and they were ready for them. The descent took hours, the lights of the machine cutting a thin cone into water that hadn't seen daylight in thousands of years. At the depth the instruments had promised, the cameras opened onto something else entirely. It wasn't a vent, and it wasn't a dome of mud. The shape on the seafloor was too deliberate to be a natural collapse, too ordered to be a flow of sediment. Every readout on deck said the same thing, that this was just another stretch of deep crust. The footage raised more questions than it answered. The structure. At 4,100 meters, the ROV held position over a formation of basalt columns. They were arranged in concentric rings, each one measuring out from the same center with a precision that cooling fractures never manage. Slow, deliberate shapes, deliberate as something built, though nothing alive could build down here. The thermal sensor registered warmth, not the cold of the surrounding seabed, a faint heat rising off the stone like an animal asleep under blankets, and at the middle of the rings, the floor simply opened, a hollow drop, descending well past the reach of the camera's light. For a moment, the crew just watched the feed, and the feed watched back. Then the magnetometer spiked, and the ROV lost orientation for 11 seconds. Magnetic anomalies. The instrument read a field 200 times stronger than the rock around it. No basalt, no natural deposit produces a signal like that. And stranger still, the field pulsed. It rose and fell in a rhythm the sonar had been hearing for weeks, the same slow beat coming up from the deep. Compasses on the ship began to spin, needles hunting for a north that had quietly stopped being true. Instrument screens rebooted themselves for no visible reason, and the ROV's thrusters fought, hard, an invisible current tugging it toward the rings, toward the hollow at their center. The pilot pulled it back, every second of the recovery a test of nerves they wouldn't name. When the machine finally broke the surface, the crew gathered around its memory cards like archaeologists around a sealed tomb. They retrieved the ROV, but the data it brought back made no geological sense. The age question. The cores they carried to the surface came from deep inside those basalt columns, and the lab dated them the way you'd date anything made of rock. Uranium decaying into lead, at a pace so steady it works like a clock. The date that came back stopped the whole project. 340 million years, late Carboniferous, a time when the continents hadn't yet finished crashing together into Pangaea. But the Bismarck Plate beneath them is barely 50 million years old. The structure, whatever it was, predated the very seafloor it sat buried in. Geologists held the two numbers side by side, the floor of the ocean and the thing embedded in it, and the arithmetic refused to line up. Rock that old doesn't belong on a plate that young. Which meant it hadn't formed here, it had arrived. The subduction hypothesis. There was one story that could explain it, and it began deep below. The theory went like this. An ancient oceanic plate, far older than the Bismarck Sea, had been dragged down into the mantle by subduction, pulled beneath the Pacific, melted and churned for hundreds of millions of years. Then a mantle plume, a slow chimney of hot rock rising from deep within the earth, carried some of that recycled material back up toward the surface. It would have been liquid mush by then. Its original structure dissolved and blended into the currents of the mantle. Subduction destroys. It melts, it churns, it homogenizes. Whatever geometry a plate once had is lost the moment it sinks past the point of no return. For this structure to have survived intact, that whole picture had to be wrong, unless something about this structure resisted melting. Material composition. They broke the samples open under the spectrograph, and the chemistry that came out didn't belong to this planet's crust at all. The basalt was laced with iridium and osmium, heavy elements almost unknown on the Earth's surface, at concentrations 40 times anything a terrestrial rock has ever produced. Then the isotope ratios settled it. They matched carbonaceous chondrites, the oldest class of meteorite, primitive material left over from the very birth of the solar system, before the planets even formed. Stone that old carries the memory of a place closer to the sun than Earth has ever been. There are only two ways such elements reach a seafloor: by cosmic impact or by being part of the impactor itself. None of the fault lines, none of the volcanic chemistry, none of it could make what the spectrograph now showed. The structure wasn't built by the Earth. Impact or arrival. The spectrograph had named the impossible iridium, an element that belongs to the sky, not to the seafloor. Yet here is the strange part. A body striking the water at cosmic velocity leaves a wound. It craters, it fractures, it deforms. This structure showed none of that. So the pieces line up in a quiet contradiction. The chemistry says it fell. The geology says it never hit. Either it descended slow enough to settle like a falling leaf, drifting through the water column for hours, or it was lowered, guided, placed here the way a tool is placed on a bench. The geometry argues for the latter. Its magnetic field is uniform in a way no accident has ever produced. Nature breaks things and buries them. Nothing in nature arranges. Whatever this is, it was shaped for a purpose, and that purpose had a signature you could read from the surface of the water. And that function was still running. The pulse accelerates. October 2020. The instruments had been counting a heartbeat for weeks, a pulse that arrived every 41 hours, steady as a metronome. Then it changed. The interval compressed to 39 hours, then to 36. Not a glitch. The pattern held, tighter and tighter, like something drawing itself up. The structure was rising, 20 meters every month now, a rate the survey team had called impossible the year before. The deformed zone around it stretched to 1.2 kilometers, and the sea itself seemed to register it. Fishing vessels working within 5 kilometers reported compasses spinning lazily, needle drifting off true north as if the sky had moved. There is a word the instruments never print in their logs, because instruments do not feel, but the data sketched it out plainly. Whatever rested down there had been dormant for a long time. Now it was waking, and it was picking up speed. The sound changes, and as it quickened, it began to speak in a new voice. The pulse grew harmonics, secondary tones layered at exact mathematical intervals, the thirds and fifths and sevenths that no natural tremor ever produces on its own. A geologist listening to the raw feed could not place it. It belonged to engineering, not to the Earth. Audio engineers ran the recording through analysis software and stopped. The waveform resembled frequency modulation, the kind of encoding a radio transmitter uses to carry a voice. The pitch was shifting against itself in patterns that looked less like noise and more like grammar. No seismic event in the record produced anything like it. No volcano, no fault slip, no magma moving through rock. The sound was not the earth groaning, it was something signaling, and signaling with intent. Decoding it became the next obsession. The message hypothesis. A handful of researchers argued that the pulse was not random seismic noise at all. They saw in it a structure, a rhythm too regular for chance, a sequence of notes played out in magnetic and acoustic oscillation. A beacon, they said, or a warning. Others called it wishful thinking, the eye finding faces in static. Pattern seeking, they argued, the oldest habit a mind has. The debate grew loud enough that it stalled the science itself. The community split between those who heard a signal and those who heard only weather. Then the second structure appeared. The second site, January 2021. Sonar surveys, meant only to map the seafloor one more time, found a second deformation zone 180 kilometers to the southeast. Same depth, same magnetic signature, same pulse. Only one detail broke the symmetry. Its rhythm was offset by exactly 12 hours. Not a mistake in the instruments, not drift in the readings. A deliberate offset, precise and unforced, two hearts beating in deliberate counterpoint. The two structures were synchronized. Whatever sat in the mud beneath the Bismarck Sea did not pulse alone. They weren't acting alone. The network. By March 2021, 4 sites were active across the sea, arranged in a rough arc like the curve of a mouth opening. Each one pulsed in sequence, one after another, building a wave of magnetic and acoustic energy that swept the region once every 33 hours. The pattern was no longer a heartbeat. It was a phrase, repeated and rehearsed. Whatever was down there had stopped sounding like something that merely existed and started sounding like something that planned. The network was coordinated. Every cycle tightened the arc, the pulse moving along it like a hand drawing closer to a point, and it was converging on a single point. The convergence point. When the researchers plotted every pulse against every receiver, the lines did not scatter, they crossed. All of them, all across the network, converging on a single zone deep beneath the seafloor, 600 kilometers down in the mantle. Deep Earth tomography, the same technique used to image weather inside a planet, found something there. A mass, roughly spherical, 40 kilometers across, denser than the rock around it, sitting in the dark like a buried stone. No one had an explanation for a body like that at that depth. It broke every model of how the lower mantle was supposed to look. The pulse did not come from the structure on the seafloor at all. It came from this. That mass had been there for a very long time. Mantle plume activity. The focal zone sat directly above an ancient mantle plume, a column of hot rock rising from near the core mantle boundary, a slow chimney that had been burning for hundreds of millions of years. Plumes are supposed to be patient. This one was not. It was accelerating, and the reading said the acceleration began at its base, where the dense mass sat. The mass was not just sitting there, it was pushing. That changed what the structures on the seafloor meant entirely. They were not vents, not the mouths of an old geological wound. They were conduits, funneling something upward, drawing it from the deep toward the surface, through channels the plume had kept open for ages. Whatever moved up them moved faster with every passing month, and that something was reaching the surface faster than anyone predicted. The third expedition. In June of 2021, a crewed submersible descended onto the primary structure, a small vessel carrying 3 people down through the water column toward the shape that had drawn so much of the ocean's attention. The approach was silent, the structure growing slowly in the lights. What they found at the center was not solid rock. It was hollow, a vertical shaft dropping away into darkness, its walls lined with veins of metal that caught their own faint glow under ultraviolet light, a thin blue-green shimmer in the black. They could not reach the bottom. The shaft descended at least 2 kilometers, far beyond the depth rating of their small machine, into space no one had measured. At 4,300 meters, they saw movement inside the shaft. The ascent. The sonar image painted something no one on the ship wanted to name. A dense form was rising through the shaft, slow but continuous, pushing past 2 kilometers of darkness. It moved the way a body moves when it is not floating, when it is climbing with purpose. The water around it glowed hot on the thermal readout, superheated mantle material wrapped around the shape like a second skin. At 200 meters long, it dwarfed the structure around it. Its surface caught the sonar and threw it back with a smoothness that rock does not have. Rock scatters sound. This thing reflected it, as if it had a skin. They watched it ascend for days, station after station, tracing a slow line up the void that had swallowed their machine. Nothing in the record moved like this. No known current, no thermal vent, no animal could account for the pace, the direction, the silence of it. The crew said little. There was no word for what they were measuring, and so they measured it in silence. It reached the base of the structure 3 days later. Surface effects. By August of 2021, something had shifted on the surface. Fishing crews in the Bismarck Sea began reporting plankton blooms unlike anything they had seen, clouds of bioluminescent life, so dense they glowed through the water at night, swirling in concentric rings above the deformation zones. The patterns were too regular to be chance, broad, slow circles turning on a center that sat directly over the structure below. Where the plankton gathered, the water ran warm. Localized pockets rose 3 degrees, a fever in the sea that held its course and did not spread. The fish noticed before anyone else did. Schools that had worked these grounds for generations began to thin, then disappear, leaving nets empty and captains quiet. The creatures of the deep read the water the way we read a road, and they were turning away. Whatever was changing down there, they felt it first. The surface carried on, sun on the waves, routine work, ordinary weather. Then the first displacement occurred. The displacement event, September 12, 2021. The sea did not give warning. At mid-morning, the primary structure surged, 400 meters of seabed rising in 6 hours, tearing through the sediment like a shoulder through skin. The upper rings broke free of the deep and stood bare in the cold water. Seismic stations on 3 islands caught the tremor, a magnitude 4.2 that rolled through the crust and registered as nothing truly felt, only a deep unease that faded before anyone could place it. But the instruments held the truth of what had moved. From the hollow center of the structure came a plume, a column of superheated water and methane rising thousands of meters toward the surface, venting pressure that had gathered for a time no one could measure. The sea above it turned white, then very, very still. For a moment, those on the ships could pretend it was geology, that the earth moves and always has. But they had watched the thing climb the shaft with their own instruments. The object inside was no longer contained. The revelation window. For 72 hours, the cameras held on what the ROV lights finally revealed. The basalt rings did not surround a random fracture. They cradled a shaft, and at its mouth sat a cap of smooth black material. So dark, the light seemed to fall into it and never come back. It was not stone, it was not metal. Whatever it was absorbed every wavelength the instruments threw at it, drinking the beam whole. Around it, the magnetic field climbed until the sensors pinned at 800 Gauss, a reading the manual said should not exist this far from a planet's core. The crew stopped speculating. They stopped calling it a formation. For 3 days, the thing simply sat there, patient, as if waiting for something, and then it began to open. The opening. The black surface did not crack along a fault line. It fractured in perfect symmetry, 6 triangular segments peeling back like petals on a closing flower, each one slow and deliberate. There was nothing accidental about the shape of it. This had been made, or grown, to open this way. Beneath the cap sat a chamber filled with a luminous fluid, thick and viscous, and it reacted to the ROV lights, not by reflecting them, but by pulsing, swelling in a rhythm that matched nothing in the water. The light was not hitting it. The light was waking something. And there, at the center, half submerged in that glow, they saw what the fluid had been hiding. A curve, a segmented shape, an organic texture that did not belong in basalt. This is what had been moving beneath the Bismarck Sea for 340 million years. The core discovery. It took the geologists a full day to say the word out loud. The object was biological. What they were looking at resembled a vast, chambered nautilus shell, but every plate was made of a crystalline material no mineralogy textbook had ever named. 180 meters across, it turned slowly in the chamber. Covering its surface were fine filaments, countless as a field of grass, and they pulsed with their own internal light. The bioluminescence did not flicker. It breathed. Thermal scans showed something stranger still. The structure was drawing heat up from the mantle, consuming it, like a lung pulling in air. Not a fossil, not a remnant. Metabolically active, they wrote, in the clipped language of frightened professionals. The thing at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea was feeding on the Earth's own warmth, and it had been doing so for eons. It wasn't dead, and it wasn't alone. The embryo hypothesis. The biologists stopped calling it a signal. They started calling it a birth. The object beneath the Bismarck Sea, they argued, was not a machine and not a wound in the Earth. It was a larva, a thing that had spent its eons inside the planet's mantle, drinking geothermal warmth the way a calf drinks milk. Every structure on the seafloor, the vents, the raised rings, the great circular basins, all of it was one immense nursery. Eggs, cocoons, and the network running between them was not a corpse's wiring, but a pulse line, a single shared heartbeat stretched across kilometers of stone. The pulse we had recorded, the 19-minute rhythm, was not random noise. It was synchronized. Every node firing in sequence, the way a flock of birds turns as one body. They were timing themselves, coordinating a staggered emergence so the entire clutch would wake together. Which meant this wasn't the only one waking up. The global scan. Within weeks, the survey went global. Magnetic anomaly scans that had sat quiet for decades were reread with new eyes, and the pattern fell into place like a key into a lock. 19 more sites. 19 dark shapes pressed against the undersides of tectonic plates. A colony off the Mariana Trench, nesting in the deepest trench on Earth. Another beneath the mid-Atlantic ridge, a chain of them strung along the seam where the seafloor splits. The Chile Rise, the Arctic Basin, each one carrying the same telltale deformation, the same slow curl of stone pushed upward from below. By late 2019, all 19 had begun to pulse. Not one site, feeding alone in the dark, 19, warming in unison, across oceans that had never once shared a single ocean. Whatever triggered the Bismarck event had triggered them all. The timing question. The question that broke the room was simple. Why now? The structures had slept for hundreds of millions of years, survived the Permian extinction, survived the dinosaurs, survived ice that reached the equator, and in the span of one human lifetime, they had all decided to wake. The researchers hunted for a common trigger: orbital mechanics, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, magnetic pole shifts, when the planet's core flips and the invisible field that shields us weakens, galactic radiation spikes, bursts arriving from outside the solar system, carrying energy no geology could explain. Each candidate fit one site and refused the others. Whatever woke 19 separate vents on the same year was not something any single ocean could explain. It was larger, slower, older. And it was, they learned, already in the data, hidden in plain sight. The solar minimum. So they pulled up the helioseismic records and checked, site by site, against the sun's own slow heartbeat. And there, in the quiet, the pattern surfaced. The onset of the pulse matched the 2019 solar minimum, the deepest stillness in the sun's 11-year cycle. In those months, the solar wind slackens and the heliosphere loosens its grip on the inner system. Galactic cosmic rays, normally deflected, rained down on Earth's surface in concentrations it hadn't seen in decades. A faint, ancient radiation reaching the sea floor, straight through everything above it. If these structures respond to that, then they've been listening all along, masked by the very shield that makes life here possible. It suggests a signal from beyond, one powerful enough to reach across interstellar distances and still whisper through miles of ocean. But the signal didn't come from the galaxy. The deep signal, it came from much closer and much older. Gravitational wave observatories, built to catch the ripple of colliding black holes, picked up something else entirely, a faint, ultra-low frequency oscillation, a vibration in the fabric of space-time itself. It hums constantly, emanating from the galactic core, a rhythm so deep and so slow that for centuries no instrument existed that could hear it. It's been there the whole time, tuning the universe beneath the noise of ordinary matter. And here is what the researchers kept coming back to. The structures under the Bismarck Sea resonate with that frequency. They match it. Not approximately, but exactly, like a struck bell answering another bell across impossible distances. They weren't waiting for a signal, they were part of one. The propagation network, which changes how you read the map entirely. The 19 sites aren't isolated anomalies. Plotted together, they draw a network that spans the planet's mantle, laid out in a pattern that mirrors the ancient subduction zones, the great seams where tectonic plates once dove into the deep. Each site sits on a node, a junction in a grid we never knew was wired. The structures don't just respond to the signal, they amplify it and relay it, passing the oscillation along through the Earth's interior, site to site, through miles of solid rock. They're not listening at all. They're infrastructure, a distribution system for something, built into the planet itself, keyed to the exact frequency of the galactic core, routed through the bones of the Earth. Built by something that understood planetary geology on scales we're only beginning to grasp. The architect question. So the question that haunts every scientist who has stared at those readings is a simple one. Who built this? The age of the network, 340 million years, drops it in the Carboniferous, that deep green age when the continents were still drifting together into Pangaea and oxygen in the air surged to levels the modern world can barely imagine. Life on the surface was exploding. Giant ferns, insects the size of your forearm, forests that would one day become the coal beds. But nothing on that ancient Earth had technology. No cities, no machines, not even a fire someone had learned to kindle. Nothing that could bore into the mantle, nothing that could lay a cable of kilometers of circuitry through solid rock and key it to the pulse of a galaxy. Everything that lived then was soft and green and silent. Whatever placed those structures understood the deep Earth the way we understand a road map, and a species that young, that small, that newly born could not have done it, unless the architects weren't from the surface. The panspermia link, the trace elements in the rock, give the first real clue. Iridium and specific chondrite isotopes, the chemical fingerprints of the early solar system, the building blocks that condensed from the cloud that gave birth to our sun. These structures were not built here. They arrived. One theory, and it is only a theory, is that they are seed ships, launched by a civilization that was already ancient when our sun was young, sent across star systems to seed life, or the infrastructure for life, into the mantles of newborn planets. Embedding deeply, where radiation cannot reach, where impacts cannot touch, where the slow churn of geology keeps the seed safe for the long, quiet waiting that deep time demands. If that is true, then Earth itself is a planted garden, a deliberate one, with the seed already in the soil. And now, synchronized across the globe, they were completing their task. The emergence begins. In November of 2021, the thing beneath the Bismarck Sea stopped waiting. After 340 million years of stillness, it breached the seafloor entirely, rising 600 meters above the mud, a spire taller than most mountains pushed up from the deep. And then it opened. From its flanks, filaments extended outward, each one stretching for kilometers, drifting in the slow current like the tentacles of some enormous jellyfish, swaying in a tide that would never reach the surface. They were not idle. Each filament began to harvest, drawing dissolved minerals from the water column, pulling rare metals and trace elements out of the sea itself, sifting the ocean molecule by molecule. The instruments watched the chemistry of the water change in patterns no natural process explains. It was not decaying, it was not eroding, it was feeding, and it was growing. Growth rate. Over those 3 months, the numbers climbed with a quiet patience. Mass increased by 40%. New segments formed along the surface, budding outward like coral in slow motion, each one deliberate, unhurried. The thermal output rose too, enough to lift a column of warm water all the way to the surface. Plankton bloomed in the bath of it, and the swarms arrived, fish and marine mammals gathering in numbers no one had seen here before. The Bismarck Sea was transforming into an oasis, but not for us. The acoustic shift. By January of 2022, the pulse pattern changed again. No longer a rhythmic beacon, it became something layered, a symphony of frequencies folded over each other, each one playing its own part. When researchers ran the audio through careful analysis, they found the signal was doing far more than announcing itself. It was modulating ocean currents, directing nutrient flow, coordinating the movement of marine life within 50 kilometers. The pulse was not a signal to be heard. It was a hand moving pieces on a board. It was engineering an ecosystem around itself. The ecosystem response, and the ecosystem answered. New species appeared near the sites: extremophile bacteria, tubeworms, bioluminescent cephalopods with no known evolutionary lineage, creatures that had no place on any existing family tree. DNA sequencing returned genetic markers that did not match Earth's tree of life at all. Either the object was introducing life into these waters, or it was activating dormant templates that had been sleeping in the dark for inconceivable lengths of time. Long before we arrived, something had written this possibility into the deep. The ocean was remembering something ancient. The global response. By the middle of 2022, the silence was over. All 19 sites now reported the same slow awakening, the same objects breaching the seafloor, the same thin filaments unreeling into the water. Above them, whole ecosystems turned strange with life. Fisheries thinned as fleets were pushed back, and one by one, governments drew exclusion zones around the locations, quietly, citing equipment loss and navigational hazards. The world's navies made maps of places they no longer fully controlled. The scientific community split cleanly down the middle. One camp argued for pure observation, patient and passive. The other demanded intervention, tools sent down, samples taken, answers forced. The two sides stopped attending each other's conferences. No one could agree on a course of action, but intervention required understanding what the network was building toward. The metamorphosis hypothesis, a small group of marine biologists, offered the theory no one wanted to hear. The objects were not static, they argued. They were mid-transformation, dormant seeds passing through a metamorphic phase into something mobile, something that could relocate or reproduce. The filaments, they pointed out, were behaving less like roots and more like nerves. They extended outward, sampled the water column, read the currents and the temperatures, folded back when conditions shifted. The structures appeared to be mapping the ocean, testing it, preparing a decision. If their numbers were right, that next stage could take decades, perhaps a century of patient sensing before any visible change. The emergency response plans, designed around the objects, were built on timescales the objects did not seem to share. It would be easy to take comfort in the thought, but nothing in the data ruled out the other possibility. Or it could happen much faster. The acceleration. In August of 2022, the rate doubled. Not at a single location. Everywhere, all at once. The Bismarck object reached 400 meters across, an expanse larger than any stadium on Earth, and its filaments stretched out 15 kilometers into the surrounding water. Then the sound changed. The metronomic pulse that had driven researchers to distraction faded, and something else rose in its place. Low, drawn-out calls, whale-like, almost mournful, rising and falling over minutes. Organic, plaintive, as if the thing had found a voice. Across the basin, other sights answered. The same mournful notes returned from 400 kilometers away, then 1,000, the calls overlapping, layering, entering into a rhythm no instrument could fully pass. The hydrophone arrays caught it all, and the listening stations fell silent on their own. They were communicating, and the conversation was intensifying. The Harmony event. For 48 hours in September of 2022, the rhythm held. All 19 objects sang together. One note passed hand to hand across the ocean floor until it became a single chord, audible to hydrophones on 4 continents. The listening stations clocked something stranger. Their magnetic signatures, previously each its own drift, began to beat in time, a slow pulse that bent satellite orbits a few meters off course and sent the migratory birds veering from routes they had followed for millennia. Mariners reported compasses finding a new north, then swinging back. Instruments read the pulse and refused. For 2 days the whole planet hummed to a frequency no one had ever heard, and then, at the hour it all began, the chorus stopped. Not faded, not fallen into silence gradually. Cut clean. When the silence broke, everything had changed. The fragmentation, October. The primary structure, the 400-meter mass that started it all, began to move, and then to come apart at seams no survey had ever mapped. 12 pieces separated from it, each exactly 30 meters across, each holding its own course. They drifted off the hulls of the parent body as if released, propelled by jets of light that flared and died, leaving thin ribbons of glowing fluid trailing behind them. Every one of them moved under its own power and its own will. No tether, no signal, no command pattern traced between them. 12 separate minds, if minds is what they were, venturing out into the open water. The parent structure went on drifting in the current, but the children did not follow it. They turned, all 12, in the same instant, and set a course no instrument could mistake, and they were heading toward deeper water. The migration. Below them lay the abyss. They descended past 3,000 meters, where the last trace of sunlight dies, past 5,000, where the pressure would fold a submarine's hull like paper, and kept going towards 6,000 and beyond, into the Hadal trenches. Tracking them became guesswork. Sound scatters down there, light is a rumor, and the fragments went quiet, all their slow songs dimmed to almost nothing. The arrays that once heard them sing now heard only the dark breathing of the deep. But the last contacts placed them over the subduction zones, those long scars where the ocean floor bends down and is dragged, mile by slow mile, back into the mantle, the place where this world remakes itself. Some researchers called it a retreat. Read the readings a different way, and it looks like something else, a journey chosen, not fled from. They were going home, or preparing for the next cycle. The cycle theory. Put every piece together, and a single story rises out of the noise. The structures don't arrive individually, they arrive as seeds. For hundreds of millions of years they rest, gestating in the dark warmth of the mantle, waiting on conditions that may take an age to line up. When they finally align, the seeds stir. They emerge, reshape what lives around them, reshape the very chemistry of the water, do their slow, quiet work, and then do what all living things do at the end of a season. They fold inward, they fragment, they sink. What moves beneath the sea isn't an invasion, it's a return visit. One phase in a rhythm so slow a human lifetime could pass and never see a full turn of it. Earth isn't their destination, it's their nursery. The implications. If the cycle theory holds, this isn't the first time. It isn't even the 100th. Beds of fossilized life too strange to place, extinctions that resist every comfortable explanation, shifts in the chemistry of ancient oceans that simply appear out of nowhere, all of it could be what the last emergences left behind. Deep time forgets thoroughly, but it keeps receipts. We sit here in the present, convinced we are the first witnesses to anything that matters. The geology says otherwise. The record of the planet is one long, patient history of arrivals and departures, and we are simply the ones awake for this particular one. Consider the quiet weight of that. What we are watching from satellites and seismographs is not a cosmic anomaly. It is routine, on a scale we can barely hold in mind. Which means we're witnessing something the planet has seen before, even if we haven't. The unknowns. And yet for all the pattern we think we see, the unknowns stack higher than the answers. How far does the network actually reach? Are there other nurseries beneath other seas, other continents, waiting their turn? The signal that drifts toward us from beyond the galaxy, we read its direction but not its meaning, and the two may be very different things. No one can say whether the fragments will ever reunite or whether they scatter for good this time. And if the cycle does complete, if it runs exactly to plan, we have no map for what a completed one looks like. Every answer we win raises a question we didn't even know to ask. The instruments keep insisting they've found something. The data keeps refusing to close. Uncertainty gathers in the water the way fog gathers at dawn, and the activity beneath the Bismarck Sea hasn't stopped. Current status. By late 2024, the picture is clearer and stranger in equal measure. The primary structure beneath the Bismarck Sea is still there, and it is still awake, letting off pulses the way a sleeping animal breathes. A magnitude 5.0 rumble rolled through the basin in November, and a 6.3 shook the water south of Lorengau back in September, each one arriving on its own schedule, never on ours. Seismographs have tracked 3 of the fragments as far as the New Britain Trench, that deep scar where one plate dives beneath another. The others have gone quiet, presumed lost to the Hadal zone, 2 miles down where the pressure would crush a submarine like paper. New deformation zones keep appearing where none were charted, shifting the seafloor a little more each time. The network is still waking up. The question is no longer what's moving beneath the Bismarck Sea, but what it will become. The observation dilemma. Here is the dilemma at the heart of it all. We can watch. We have instruments that can feel a tremor from 1,000 miles away, cameras that can descend into the black, but we cannot intervene. To reach down and touch the source of all this movement, to drill toward it or nudge it or ask it politely to stop, would mean risking an ecological catastrophe in one of the richest coral seas on Earth. And it might not even respond to us. It might simply answer in a language of pressure and heat that our hands were never meant to speak. Nothing about these objects reads as hostile, nothing reads as kind either. They simply are, the way a mountain simply is, or a glacier, or the tide. They operate on a scale of time that makes our centuries look like a single held breath, and their logic is not ours to follow. All we have is the watching, and so we watch, the way you would watch weather moving across an ocean you can never sail. We are witnesses to a process that began before our species existed. The silence we carry. And yet, out in the everyday world, almost none of this has been heard of. The findings sit in scientific journals, read by a few hundred specialists who trade paragraphs the way others trade stories. The debates happen in closed sessions, in rooms lit by projector screens, voices kept low. The news cycle has not touched it. No anchor has said the words, no ticker has carried the story. Cities keep their lights on, markets keep their numbers climbing, airplanes trace their arcs across the sky, and no one on board knows what stirs beneath the water 2 oceans away. It is possible to stand on a beach in New Britain and watch the horizon and feel nothing at all, because nothing here announces itself. The sea shrugs, the sun sets, the day folds into evening, and the deep goes on doing what it has always done. There is a quiet mercy in that, in being allowed to live a life untouched by the enormity underneath. Maybe the world is not ready for it. Maybe it never will be. Perhaps that's for the best. The patience of deep time. Consider what a breath looks like from far away. The Earth draws one roughly every 27.5 million years, a pulse that studies of 89 major geological events, picked out with 96% confidence. Our whole recorded history, every empire we've raised and buried, fits inside a single pause between those breaths. The structures beneath the Bismarck Sea keep time that way. A mantle plume can slumber for 100, perhaps 200 million years before it stirs. When it finally rises, whole oceans rearrange themselves around it. Dinosaurs that never met each other share the same continent of rock their generations rose from and sank back into. Measured against that, a human lifetime is a flicker of phosphorescence on the surface of the dark water. Even a civilization is a blink that begins and ends between two earthquakes. And still they cycle onward, patient, unhurried, indifferent to what blooms above them in the brief, warm years. They were here before the first reef, before the first continent learned to hold its shape, and they will be here when the last one forgets. They remind us that the Earth is not ours alone. What we've learned. So what did this event give us, besides a sight we never expected? It redrew the map of planetary biology. Life, we had assumed, needed a surface, sunlight, a biosphere we could recognize. Now we hold evidence that biology may extend into the mantle itself, organisms woven into geologic process, living on timescales that outlast species. The Titan Ridge volcano, active across a 5-kilometer stretch of seafloor 125 kilometers off Manus Island, erupted with a violence no textbook gave warning of, and then kept going, vent at or near the surface, building its cone in the dark. Satellites watched it from above. Seismometers felt it come. Yet the deepest question is not what it made above the waves. It is whether a world can host a life form vast enough to be mistaken for geology, patient enough to spend 1,000,000 years on a single slow movement, alien not in shape but in rhythm. Planets themselves, it begins to look like, may be hosts to such beings, things we have never conceived of and may never fully know. Every unanswered reading, every plume we cannot yet explain, is a sentence in a language still being learned, and it's still teaching us. The watching continues, so the work goes on. Around the clock, teams in Rabaul and beyond keep their instruments aimed at every known site, listening through the noise of the sea for the next tremor. New sensors go down in the deep water. New models are built on supercomputers. New hypotheses tested against the same stubborn rocks. Magnitude 5.4 events, steam plumes, pumice rafts, all logged like weather you can never quite predict. The monitoring is slow, it is meticulous, and it is humbling, because every day it reminds us how much lies beneath us that we cannot see, and how late we came to the asking. We are students enrolled in a course that started 4.5 billion years before we arrived, with no syllabus and no final exam. The Bismarck Sea is quiet tonight, as far as quiet means anything down there. Somewhere in the blackness past the last depth light, magma is still moving, still rising, still deciding what it wants to become. We could not stop it if we tried, and we would not, because watching is a kind of reverence. Whatever it is that stirs there, it has been patient with us. It can afford to keep waiting. If you'd like to stay open to the deep, slow currents of the world with us, subscribe, and we'll keep watching together.